Velkommen til webinar. Velkommen til PwC's række af webinarer, hvor vi klæder jer på til at arbejde med blandt andet noget af det nye, spændende, måske også en lille smule skræmmende regulering, der er iværksat. I det her webinar vil vi tale om EU-taksonomi-alignment rapportering. Vi har valgt at fokusere på de krav, der stilles til den finansielle sektor, og det har vi gjort, fordi der er en stribe krav, som både gælder de finansielle virksomheder, men som jo selvfølgelig så også vil komme til at påvirke de virksomheder, der skal levere data ind til de finansielle virksomheder. Vi er rigtig glade for at se, at vi har mere end 400 af jer, som har meldt jer til at lytte og se med live. Og I skal jo vide, at I altid kan gå ind på vores hjemmeside og se det igen, eller se nogle af de temaer, som I måske er gået glip af. I dag har jeg fornøjelsen at introducere nogle af mine ekspertkolleger, og jeg vil i virkeligheden bare give ordet videre til Nikolaj Wassermann, som vil styre slagets gang herfra med gæster både i studiet og online. Så hæng fast, det bliver rigtig spændende, og vi håber, at I, som I plejer, vil stille rigtig mange spørgsmål, som vi skal bestræbe os på at svare undervejs. Tak.
Tak, Susanne. Thank you and good morning. We've chosen to do this, the rest of the webinar in English, since we have some non-Danish speakers with us today. So I just want to thank you all for taking your time to join this webinar. I know we have an exciting agenda ahead of us today, and I have some very good colleagues, and we have a guest in the studio as well. So if we start, we have Marie-Louise Andersen, who's one of our Danish ESG experts within financial sector. We have with us today as well Sofia Jacquard, who's one of our international ESG experts. And then we're very lucky to have Søren Andersen, who's head of ESG from Nykredit, with us today as well. So and they will share their knowledge and some cases on how to work with the taxonomy alignment reporting that is coming up beginning of next year. Then we can just for everyone to be calm, we will share the slides afterwards. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to post them in the chat, and we will do our best to answer the questions during the chat or during the webinar. Now I will give the word to Marie-Louise.
Thank you, Nikolaj. So good morning, everyone. In this first part of the webinar, we'll just quickly walk you through why it is that we are talking about taxonomy reporting today. Many joining on us today's webinar will have noticed that ESG is a topic which has become of higher and higher importance on the agenda within many companies in the last few years. This is mainly due to a regulatory push from the EU. The EU has put ESG high on the regulatory agenda and incorporated ESG requirements, reporting obligations and other demands into both existing and new legislative frameworks. This ESG journey, if we call it that, it begins with the introduction of the EU Action Plan on Financing Sustainable Growth from 2018. With this action plan, the EU decided that the financial sector should be a key driver for facilitating the EU's transition to net zero by 2050. The action plan, which you see on this slide, consists of 10 overall work packages, which one way or another impacts all actors within the financial system. Today, we will only focus on the first of these packages, this being the taxonomy regulation. The EU taxonomy is a classification system for economic activities that are considered environmentally sustainable when measured against 6 defined environmental objectives. These objectives set out performance threshold, these so-called technical screening criteria for taxonomy-aligned economic activities. These 6 defined environmental objectives are not all finalized. The first 2 on climate are finalized, but the 4 remaining ones are in consultation. Importantly, however, all of these objectives should be considered in the context of reporting. The so-called Article 8 of the taxonomy regulation, which we will focus on today, requires large financial and non-financial entities to provide information to investors on the environmental performance of assets and economic activities. this reporting obligation is to be included in the non-financial statements. As opposed to the last two reporting periods where financial entities were only to report on the percentage of their eligibility and non-eligibility, financial entities now have to report on their first taxonomy alignment from January 2024 for the reference period 2023. Looking at non-financial entities, they were required to report on their taxonomy alignment for the last reference period, this being 2022. They had to report on the share of their turnover, CapEx and OpEx expenditures associated with environmental sustainable activities defined as per the taxonomy regulation. The taxonomy regulation interlinks with many important parts of the EU action plan as shown just before. We won't deep dive into these interlinks today, but it's important to keep in mind that the obligation of Article 8 in the taxonomy regulation will going forward be included in the CSRD. Simultaneously, the taxonomy regulation interlinks with the SFDR regulation, and this is because financial market participants must report the percentage of their taxonomy alignment on a product level. Looking at the timetable for the taxonomy Article 8 reporting obligation, it has been subject to several changes, and different implementation deadlines exist, whether the scope being financial or non-financial. As this slide tries to highlight quite in a simplified way, financial entities in scope of the non-financial reporting directives, so with companies with over 500 employees, must prepare and report for the first time next year for the reference period 2023 on the taxonomy alignment for the first two environmental objectives. Simultaneously, eligibility reporting must be done for the remaining 4 environmental objectives. As mentioned before, going forward, the scope of financial entities which are required to report on Article 8 on the taxonomy regulation will be broadened with the introduction of the CSRD from 2025. Therefore, while you may not be in scope to report on the taxonomy next year, this might change going forward, and we highly recommend that this be assessed. The differences in the task between reporting taxonomy eligibility versus reporting taxonomy alignment are substantial, and this is best illustrated using the next slide. We've divided the taxonomy journey up in 5 compliance steps. So for the previous 2 reporting periods, financial entities only had to report on the taxonomy eligibility. So whether the economic activities of the financial institution were included within one of the environmental objectives with a specific NACE code. In practical terms, identifying eligibility is the first steps towards assessing the potential alignment of economic activities with the taxonomy's technical screening criteria. But going forward, financial entities must go through all 5 of these steps in order to report on the taxonomy alignment using specific financial KPIs and thereby ensuring compliance. We've mentioned these KPIs that exist for financial institutions, but what are they? Starting from the left of this slide, it's worth just to mention that for non-financial entities, their disclosures ought to reflect a company's contribution to all 6 environmental objectives in percentage of revenue, CapEx and OpEx, and importantly, when doing so, ensuring that there's no double counting. For financial undertaking, which of course are of interest to us today, we work with 4 different types of institutions, these being investment firms, credit institutions, asset managers, and insurance. For each of these types of financial undertakings, specific KPIs relating to the proportion of environmental sustainable economic activities in their financing activities must form part of mandatory reporting going forward. For each of these types of institutions, specific annexes and reporting template has been developed. These documents include the details for how the numerator and denominator of taxonomy-aligned economic activities must be reported on. Going forward, it explains how they should be understood, calculated, and reported. If we go through them one by one, credit institutions will going forward, it will for credit institutions going forward be mandatory to report on the agreed asset ratio, i.e. the proportion of assets financing and invested in taxonomy-aligned economic activities as a proportion of total covered assets. Also introduced are KPIs for off-balance sheet exposures, i.e. the management challenging contribute to channel capital flows towards economic activities that could be assessed as taxonomy-aligned. Introduced are also KPIs for services other than lending and asset management, here under fees and commission income linked to with taxonomy-aligned activities. The green asset ratio for trading portfolio is also introduced, and which should show the extent to which trading is done with environmental sustainable assets. If we look at investment firms going forward, it will be mandatory for them to report on the green asset ratio, as is the case for credit institutions. They must also report on KPIs, on revenues here under the proportion of revenue from investment services and activities that are linked to taxonomy-aligned economic activities. Asset managers will going forward it will going forward be mandatory to report on the ratio of investment aligned with the taxonomy. Here we have our good colleague Sophia on the call who will deep dive into these specific KPIs later on in this presentation. For issuers, it will going forward be mandatory to report on the ratio of those investments that are directed at funding or associated with taxonomy-aligned investment. It will also be mandatory to report on several KPIs which relates to the sustainable underwriting activities which are in accordance with the environmental objective on climate specifically. The discussion about taxonomy alignment and reporting naturally opens up for a discussion about data. And on that note, I hand it over to you, Sophia.
Thank you very much, Marie-Louise. When we look at the different KPIs for financial institutions, one thing that strikes, of course, as vital is the data. And this is one of the biggest challenges currently for the industry overall. Financial institutions are highly dependent on good quality data from the investee companies or from the exposures that they have on the taxonomy alignment. The data itself is dependent on the underlying exposure. So think in case of asset managers, for example, if it's an investment in companies or in other asset classes. In case of exposures to funds, there is a look-through required. So this means the data that is required is not only from like the direct exposures, but only from the indirect exposures. And it's always mandatory to use the most recently available data on taxonomy that is provided by, for example, asset managers, by the underlying investee entity or the counterparty. Estimations and proxies, on the other side, are not allowed for the mandatory KPIs that we saw earlier, which is also, of course, a challenge because it massively reduces the available data or the methods that financial institutions can use in their assessments. But it is still useful, so such proxies or estimations are still useful as part of complementary voluntary disclosures for such financial institutions. And one of the most important data sources would be, of course, the reporting of the underlying companies themselves, which would take place in form of such very complex templates in a very granular manner. And this is what financial institutions will have to take into account. So when we're talking about data, there are key challenges that need to be considered when tackling the ESG data problem. On one side, the data availability. So is the data available from the investee companies, and when it will be available, especially on the alignment. The availability itself is not the only thing, also the granularity, as you will see a little bit later with the example of asset management. The data itself is just not one KPI, but it's a lot of different granular data that is required from the underlying assets that might not be readily available. We still do have problems with data comparability and consistency, as sometimes there is a little bit of an interpretation room for the companies on how they are reporting. And of course, this should, in the upcoming years, be remedied through the standard market practice. The last thing, of course, is the data verification. Data, especially by third-party providers, data providers might not always be of high quality and of the necessary standards that is required. So just a few recommendations when you're getting into the ESG data challenges. It's important to establish a dedicated ESG data management system and database with a defined governance, so who is doing what and who is responsible for what. Also, very important, ESG data validation process, even if you're using external data providers for this data, which also leads to having a data provider due diligence and monitoring processes, and developing dedicated internal expertise in ESG data analysis and reporting. So coming from the data, we are going to deep dive in the individual KPIs of one financial undertaking type, which is the asset management. Just as a recap, currently the in-scope entities, asset managers, are only required to report on eligibility reporting, like mentioned in the first part. This is totally different from what is coming up, as you will see, but the current standard is to have a rather high-level disclosure in terms of exposures to taxonomy eligible and non-eligible economic activities, and also individual disclosures in terms of exposures to central government, central banks, and supranational issuers, also derivatives and non-NFRD entities. So these kind of KPIs or information are consolidated, so there is no further breakdown that is required, and the use of templates is just voluntary. So currently these different information can just be included in a way that the asset manager finds suitable as part of the non-financial reporting. Also, in addition to this, there is some qualitative information that is required, but it's still much higher level than what will be in the future, as we will see with the alignment reporting. The alignment reporting starting next year will be mandatory on templates. So there are specific templates for all financial institutions, and of course specifically for asset managers, that need to be filled in. These templates have a prescribed structure. They also have a prescribed information, which is much more granular on like in comparison to the eligibility reporting itself. And if we deep dive to the main KPI for asset managers, this is the green investment ratio that needs to be disclosed. This is a weighted average value of all of the investment that is managed by an asset manager, directed at funding or associated with taxonomy-aligned economic activities that are managed by the asset manager. And this is relative to the value of the total assets covered. So there is a new kind of definition of which are the total covered assets, for example, excluding investments in sovereign entities, which don't need to be included in this KPI. It's important to note that this KPI covers both activities from collective portfolio management services, so funds, but also from individual portfolio management, discretionary portfolio management mandates. So important to take this into account for the scoping of the KPI. And of course, depending on the size of the asset manager and the assets under management, this could have major implications in terms of data requirements and also underlying processes for calculating this KPI. There is a high reliance, of course, on the underlying data disclosed by the investee companies, especially because the KPI needs to be expressed both in percentages, but also in monetary value based on the underlying turnover and CapEx disclosed by these entities. And there are also some additional guidance when the exposure is, for example, towards a financial company. This is the main KPI. It looks rather simple, but then in addition to this, we have additional KPIs or additional complementary information that is also mandatory, again, based on the template that is prescribed. We have two parts there. So one is additional complementary disclosures on the breakdown of the denominator of the KPI, which should disclose, for example, the percentage of derivatives relative to the total assets, or also the proportion of exposures to EU companies that are not subject to NFRD or not disclosing, both for non-financial and financial undertakings, exposure to the non-EU companies, also not subject to NFRD, again, breakdown non-financial and financial undertakings. Then we have a proportion of exposures to financial and non-financial undertakings that do disclose under the taxonomy. So it's kind of a breakdown of the different exposures to companies over the total assets that are covered, total covered assets under the green investment ratio. And also a proportion of exposures to other counterparties, and the value of all the investments that are funding economic activities that are not taxonomy eligible at all. So here we have the connection with the taxonomy eligibility, and also like a complementary KPI on all the taxonomy eligible economic activities that are not taxonomy aligned, again, relative to the total value of the total assets covered by the KPI. And all of these different information need to be expressed in percentages again, and also in monetary amounts. So again, a lot of calculations, a lot required, a lot of underlying processes for aggregation that you need to have in place. In addition to this KPI, we have, or to this information, we have additional complementary disclosures with a breakdown of the numerator of the green investment ratio, where it's mostly the proportion of taxonomy-aligned exposure of financial and non-financial in undertakings that are required to disclose, so NFRD entities, over the total assets, again, for financial and non-financial undertakings, both for turnover and capital expenditures based, so CapEx based percentages and monetary amount. Also required for the numerator is the proportion of taxonomy-aligned exposures to other counterparties covered by the KPIs in taxonomy-aligned activities, again, turnover-based and CapEx-based. So again, a lot of very granular, detailed information. And on top of this, we also have a breakdown per environmental objective. So asset managers would need to disclose all of their taxonomy-aligned activities per objective based on turnover and CapEx in percentages for like each of the six objectives. So really granular, and even provide a further breakdown, turnover and CapEx based on transitional activities and enabling activities. So really a lot of data, a lot of calculations and aggregation that is required. This transparency is like I mentioned, much bigger than what we currently see under the eligibility reporting. So how can you prepare as an asset manager? There, of course, different approaches. What we would recommend is to start first with a general strategy. So think about how you want to start the project and how the taxonomy reporting fits into the current reporting environment and framework. It's especially recommended to think about other obligations under ESG reporting on entity level, such as SFDR or CSRD, of course, or NFRD currently, but also voluntary obligations that the asset manager is currently doing or disclosing upon or is planning to do. For example, net zero commitments or PRI reporting, TCFD reporting. Ideally, all of these different reporting frameworks need to be looked into together with the taxonomy, of course, in order to identify identify the most effective approach and how you can leverage from one reporting to another, and to avoid inconsistencies and more work. Important to consider is also the ambition of the asset manager. So how far do we want to go as an asset manager, especially in terms of voluntary reporting. So like we mentioned, these are just the mandatory KPIs, but asset managers may further disclose further information on a voluntary basis. So it makes sense to also think the own ambition on the ESG strategy and taxonomy reporting. Also under consideration of peers and market practice that is aligned with the ambitions of the asset manager. Important thing to consider also is to do an analysis of the status quo. So all the processes, the tools, the reports, what is currently being available, what kind of data is available on what kind of platforms or ESG data framework, in order to start with the implementation and the concepts behind it. So once you have the general strategy and like the status quo analysis, it's recommended to continue with form of methodology concept. This concept should concentrate on the interpretation of the regulatory requirements and what it means specifically for the business or for the types of assets that the asset manager has, and to develop, of course, technical concepts for the taxonomy reporting, simplifications, ESG data providers, selection, and so on. In terms of operationalization, depending on the approach, then the implementation would start with the whole new processes, systems, tools. It's recommended to document, of course, everything in advance in form of, for example, business requirement documents to really be able to have an effective implementation. And also to remember that the taxonomy reporting it's a massive exercise, so you need to have the necessary resources and expertise across all of the asset manager value chain in order to be able to do the reporting. After that, of course, the rollout and the finalization of the implementation, again, very undertaking specific. If there are subsidiaries or if it's a group of an asset manager, then there needs to be a rollout plan, how these other entities are impacted or how the information flow will work. And again, bear in mind, a lot of stakeholders will be impacted by this, starting from investments, but also through accounting, the reporting landscape, of course, sustainability unit, but also risk management and IT, of course. And then the last would be to test and go live. Of course, very much dependent on the size of the asset manager and the complexity of the assets under management of the business and the reporting strategy. It may be necessary to have several phases, testing phases, in order to be able to have a high quality taxonomy reporting. And remember the granularity that you have when you're reporting based on these KPIs. It's very, very transparent. So every mistake will be very transparent to the public, as these are public disclosures. So this is these are our recommendations for specifically asset managers and the KPIs on asset managers. And back to you, Nikolai.
Thank you so much, Sophia. This truly sounds very, very complicated. And now I will give the word to Søren, who will tell us how is it actually done in reality. So,
thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. I will tell you a little bit about how we actually use the information that we need to use. As Sophia just said, we are actually already live in doing a lot of reporting and using a lot of data on the product side directly to customers. So that's really my view here today, to present what we have actually been doing. And yes, I will add even more complexity. Sorry about that. But hopefully I will also give you a view of how this could actually be done. And I'm very much aware that there are financial institutions out there. My take on this is really, yes, we need to do all of this reporting as well. We are doing quite a bit today, but what we actually need is data from you, the other financial institutions, but we also need a lot of data to be able to do this reporting from all of the issuers. So maybe some of you have already been contacted by different investors that really look for information. And hopefully I will give you a little bit of insight into why we actually need this, because this is highly complex, and at times you might also think that this is a little bit crazy. So first slide, and now, sorry if you think this is the branding slide where Nykredit will tell you that we are the best in the world and the answer to all of the sustainability challenges that we have. That might be the case a few years ago, but this slide is, of course, to tell you what we are. Our ambition is to be the most sustainable asset manager in Denmark. I'm very much aware that we have a lot of competitors that have exactly the same ambition, and we actually think that that is a really good thing, because this is what we need to do. We need to do this as a sector. We need to do this as companies all around to be able to meet those challenges. However, the reason why I have this slide is to put a little bit of flavor into what Sophia talked about, the voluntary KPIs. The thing about this being voluntary, the thing is, it's voluntary to be ambitious, right? But once you are ambitious, you have to report on it. So it's a little bit like bringing up the kids and telling them, what do you think? And if they want to do something, then they need to do it right. So our ambition is to contribute to the SDGs, and of course be a net zero asset manager. All of this is not necessarily, well, the climate and SDGs are really important elements in the Sustainable Finance Initiative. However, it's voluntary for us to tell our clients that we want to participate. But once we have told them that, then we need to report on it. And show away processes, all of that, which Sophia also told about. So these elements really interact, and in a very good way, I should say, because, I mean, of course, it shouldn't be possible to just claim that you want to do something and then not do anything about it. So I think we're just putting all the soft law that we've had for many years now into practice. So we've seen a few timelines here. This is a timeline actually based from the Danish coast of North Zealand. So if you haven't prepared your summer vacation yet, this could be it. And this is a winter picture, so it will probably be the same picture, temperature a few months from now. No, so the reality is that the SFDR regulation that Sophia also talked about has been a reality to us. It's been in place since March 2021. This means that we actually had to publish policies, targets, the voluntary stuff that we put out there, but also report on it. And we actually needed to report on it 2022. Then we had, I think, the most important element in this, the suitability regulation, the MiFID II regulation had an additionality. I think sometimes it's very good to just take a step back. I mean, we let's not kid ourselves. It's not like that sustainability reporting is going to be a new featured documentary on Netflix anytime soon. Maybe someday, I don't know. But the reality is that we need this data, and this data is so important for us to be able to connect the investments with the preferences of the clients. All of these elements also play a part in product governance that was actually also stepped into force in November. And then, of course, all of the prospectuses, and some of that is still in Danish, sorry. But the thing is, we've actually had to update all of our pre-contractual documents, available, the promises directly on the specific products to clients end of this year on the new level 2. And there we also have additional templates. So a lot of love to those guys producing the EU templates. I should highlight that with the template that on the taxonomy, we should probably also expect an update pretty soon. So we've been using the level 2 template now for 3 months, and we are already updating it because it's way too complex, and we have a lot of work on that. So from me is also to say that there will be a lot of updates. And my experience is also that this will, there is a best effort element into this. But I mean, we are also professionals, and we want to do it the right way. This is just just to show you the importance, because sometimes, when we do reporting as a business, we seem to forget, the entire food chain of what is happening here. What is live now is actually, and it has been so for more than 6 months, is that we need to ask customers, what are your preferences actually? Find a matching product to that. Have that also into our data warehouse, agree with customers, and then we need to report on it and evaluate. It all seems fairly simple, but it's not, because we need to have that data in place. And the really important part here is also that we need to report on taxonomy alignment. But the reality is that we actually needed to ask the customers, what are your preferences actually to having your investment aligned with the taxonomy? We do have very, very slim amounts of data actually reported, but we need to have it anyway. That's the reason why we actually use a lot of assessed data from data providers. The other really important element there is also sustainable investments. So if you are a company that is actually doing a lot within the social sphere, fear not, you do not have to wait for the social taxonomy to arrive in many years from now. We actually have the opportunity to define what is sustainable investments outside the taxonomy alignment. And then we have the principal adverse indicators that we also need to report on. So it actually all comes together in one big piece of information. This is just a few things from the prospectus that we have on one of our funds. It's supposed to be very client friendly. It's not, but it will be improved. But there's a lot of data that we actually need to use, and this is a SFDR Article 8 product. But you might want to look in the upper right corner there, and there's actually a minimum of 3%, as I think it is, on taxonomy aligned investments. So it is out there already, and we need to and have reported on what was actually the taxonomy aligned investments in this specific fund. We need just to aggregate it, right? On an as a manager level. That's not my point here. My point here is that we need these data to be able to run through this highly complex, and this is actually a simplified. So maybe using Sophia's words here again, this might look simple. I don't think it does, but we need to have also your recommendation to have a really stringent approach to data. To let's put it fairly, we have used going backwards. I mean, a lot of data from different data providers. Of course, there is a due diligence when you look for the data for the data provider. There's also a due diligence in the way that we've used the data, but that due diligence is taken to a completely new level. Also, when it comes to procedures, all of the financial sector is now writing new processes, new controls and stuff like that we need to have in place to ensure that we are actually meeting the targets that we set. So just for your info, you see the different funds on the left. These funds have all different investments, and that feeds into our data warehouse. And the investments are, of course, linked to the ESG data that we have from the ESG providers. Some of you out there might think, well, we report to you, so why don't you just directly use the data that we reported to you? And there's one simple reason, and that is the amount of data. So we actually use it on mortgage bonds. We actually collect the data ourselves. But on other data, we use data from MSCI ESG research. We also have other data, and that needs to feed into this data warehouse that then processes the different data, makes it available for my team, the ESG team, but also for controlling compliance purposes. And of course, when we need to make decisions in our forum on sustainable investments, the boards and so forth. So all of this data also feeds into web pages, into reports. Some of you know of the EET templates, a big Excel sheet where we have the different KPIs. That's also a very, very important element in this. So that's just to show you how we've been doing it. I suppose a lot of colleagues out there are doing something quite similar. So this is just to, maybe share our burden with you that this is a big task. There's a lot of work into this, but there's only one way to do it, and that is to have a very stringent approach to your processes, to your data governance, so that you can actually make sure that you can also report on the specific things that you promise to your customers. So this is an important element, because we cannot do this without getting data from you, and I think that's really my real important message is even though that you have deadlines coming up, the more data that you today are able to report on, the better. And making sure that you also get your reports embedded into the ESG providers. There are a lot of different providers out there. They are also getting regulated. Good for that. But the really important part is to make sure that your data is getting used. So making sure that you get the data right, that you do a lot of this work, but also making sure that the investors actually get this data, because this means that you get a fair treatment by the investment community and all of the European investors that are already covered, that are already obliged to use this data today. So I think my take really on this highly complex regulation is really that it is working. There's a lot of improvements that needs to be done, but it's also extremely important that we all are aware that this is a new age in time. We need the data to be able to claim that your companies are in fact as sustainable as they are. That's the word for me.
Thank you, Søren. Very interesting to understand how you do it in Nykredit. We'll just move on. We have a number of events, and I will just briefly touch upon those. We have an event coming up the 23rd of May, which is about know your climate risks, and we have another event coming up in June about charters. But just jumping to the Q&A, I've received a very relevant question for you. So what do you do in the case where the company that you are looking at does not do any taxonomy reporting?
So that's actually what we've been doing for quite a while now. And so we actually have two opportunities we do both. So first of all, the Commission actually touched upon this because, how do you report on something that's not reported on? And so the Commission said that if you're not allowed to do your own assessments, you are allowed to use the reported data. But if there's no reported data, you're actually allowed to use taxonomy data from third-party providers. And so we use the assessments made by MSCI ESG Research as part of bridging this gap. So what if MSCI then does not have any data?
That's another question.
Yeah. And then it becomes a little bit difficult, right? Because then the reality is, even though we might know this company very well, we cannot document that they are actually doing something that's aligned with the taxonomy. And so if that is the case, if we cannot document it, of course we cannot claim it. And if we have a product like the one that you just saw, and we are, closing in on that minimum share, then that company becomes uninvestable. And I think that's not to scare everybody out there, but that's just the reality. So we really need that reporting because otherwise, there will be elements of the capital markets that will close down, and that's not where we want to go, right?
No, exactly. Yeah. So this should put more emphasis on actually companies providing the data or doing their best to provide taxonomy data.
And maybe just also a recommendation to all of you here on the webinar that needs to do the reporting. If you've not yet reached out to Investor Relations department, please do that and have them as part of the process, because they will, if they've not asked you already, they will come with some of these questions as well.
Yeah, I've seen a question for you as well, Marie-Louise. Should the taxonomy reporting be externally assured? Is that
That's not the case at this stage, but it will be. So for now, the Article 8 reporting obligation under the taxonomy is within the scope of the non-financial reporting directive, and there is no requirement to have it assured. But going forward, when the taxonomy Article 8 obligation will be copied into the CSRD directive from 2025, there will, to begin with, be a requirement to have it limited assured. So that means that your accountants will come and look at how you've done it and your whole process for doing it. So, of course, that is a whole new level of complexity to have ESG data limited assured. So, that is very important to keep in mind.
And I think the next question is for you, Sophia. So, can you hear us? How is the EU taxonomy relevant for smaller asset managers or financial institutions that do not fall under the obligation for the entity reporting currently?
Well, the first option would be, or possibility would be, that the asset managers are currently not falling, but maybe under CSRD in the upcoming years. So it's very important to assess this CSRD applicability to know and start early with implementation. The other thing is, of course, under the product disclosures, like the SFDR Article 8 and 9, the expectation is that there is a taxonomy reporting for all of the products that have some form of environmental characteristics or objectives. So this is data that needs to be collected anyway and reported independently of the ambitions and the size of the asset manager.
Thank you. I have another question. Søren briefly, and I'll take that to you, Sophia. Søren briefly mentioned something about social objectives. So the current EU taxonomy only focuses on environmental objectives. What about social objectives? Is that something that's coming up?
That's a very good question, because currently there was a proposal on social taxonomy that came last year, and it entailed some form of like social objectives and sub-objectives. However, it seems that this proposal is currently on hold by the European Commission, and it's not clear whether it will come. But on the other hand, it seems that the approach currently from the Commission is to strengthen the whole good governance and safeguards approach, so the due diligence as part of the taxonomy for social compliance with international norms. So we have to see what happens in the future and if it comes.
Thank you, Sophia. Then I have a question for you, I think, Marie-Louise, or I will give it to you at least. So why was the concept of eligibility reporting introduced when it does not say that much if an economic activities fall within a NACE code?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Eligibility was not really part of the first plan when we did when the taxonomy was introduced, but there was a lot of delays due to political discussion as the EU. That's always the case with the EU. So eligibility came in as a first obligation because we didn't have the necessary knowledge and technical screening criteria to do the alignment. And in that sense, it makes sense because eligibility is the first step of this compliance test to do taxonomy alignment reporting. And the work that has been done the first years on eligibility can be used to further develop the analysis to do alignment analysis later on. But of course, eligibility numbers don't say a lot if an economic activity might be taxonomy aligned or not. So it was kind of a solution that came in, but it was not part of the original plan.
Yeah, that's interesting how things develop over time.
Taxonomy is very much a evolving thing. Yeah.
So another question related to that, Sophia, are there any plans to expand the taxonomy further than the social that you just mentioned, the social objectives?
We actually have some proposals as well. On one side, of course, expanding the current technical criteria under the objectives and like putting more activities and revising the criteria, which is going to be done on a regular basis anyway. But beyond that, there were also proposals to have a kind of an extended taxonomy with activities such as neutral activities or activities that are based on a green, yellow and red system to show this transition and to not penalize companies that want to go through this transition, because currently the green activities, the taxonomy aligned activities are extremely limited, and it is a very yes and no, like binary system that has been criticized, of course, for this. So a lot of interesting proposals. Again, we'll have to see how the Commission, the European Commission, will go further.
Yeah. Thank you, Sophia. Søren, do you have anything to add on that one?
I just want to add, and maybe I would like to use this discussion on the transition taxonomy, which is, well, in discussion, as you mentioned, Sophia. The thing is that to me, actually, it actually shows that this is working, and this should be taken very seriously, because I mean the aim of this is sustainable development, and as you said, Sophia, the taxonomy definitions today are very, very narrow. Some think that actually they should be more than narrow, right? They will develop over time, but the thing that we need this transition taxonomy, it really shows you that the aim here is actually to make sure that we have capital flowing into a more sustainable transition into a more sustainable economy. And so to me, actually, this shows that that the system is working. And I don't think that we should underestimate how this system that's already more or less in place will define some of the capital flows that we will see going forward. It seems maybe a little bit vague. I mean, like my kids' savings and stuff like that, and my own for that, but not that high savings. Why is this actually making a difference? Because we are a lot more wealthy than we actually think, and that goes especially for Europe. I mean, quite often we look at some of the companies with huge wealth funds and stuff like that. But the thing is, the pension funds of Europe are very wealthy, and they are actually playing a very important part in the capital structure of the world. And when you combine that with the private wealth of ordinary Europeans, it actually becomes quite a bit. So to me, I think that this will have a direct effect, and it is beginning to work, but this will work better and should work better. And that's very good that we have a little bit of time to do that, because I mean, we can make the data work, and so that would sort of be my take on this. We should not underestimate how this system is going to affect the capital flows.
Thank you. Interesting consideration. I think time is running out, and I would just like to thank you, Marie-Louise. Thank you, Sophia, and thank you, Søren, for sharing all your knowledge. And I guess that you have a lot more knowledge that you didn't have time to share today. And thank you all for listening in. I hope that you got some answers to some of the questions. There are very many questions that we cannot, unfortunately, answer all of them today. So thank you for listening in, and I wish you a wonderful day.